Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This is a podcast where we break and destroy the false idols and icons of the digital postmodern age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and this episode will be a solo episode. Now, before I get into the content, I would like to mention that I am hosting an esoteric group trip to India via Trova Trip. There are some amazing early bird discounted slots left, so if you want to go on that trip and see some of the most important and beautiful spiritual sites in the world with a community of spiritual speakers alongside you, you should register for that right now. The link to it will be in the YouTube caption or in the show notes on a podcasting platform. So definitely check that out. Now, for this topic, I'm going to explore something that I feel has been explored by other people, but in a way that I find fundamentally unsatisfying and in some cases actually a bit of an issue because this is a very sensitive subject, and one that I don't know. I've not discussed at length because I've not wanted to do it a disservice. But after really thinking about it, I think it is worth having the conversation. Um, and that is the spiritual dimension of disease and illness. Now, I have addressed mental health and esotericism a few times over the years, and how kind of to walk that line. And we will be getting into that again in this episode. But this is also going to explore physical disease and spiritual disease as well as mental illness. I feel like when people talk about, practicing mysticism as born with an illness, it does overwhelmingly tend to be conversations about mental illness, but there are other illnesses that people deal with, and I think those are worth discussing because when you are a mystic, you're on this path for a long time, right? This path, as I've said many times, is the rest of your life. And throughout your life, you're going to have illnesses at some point in time, whether it's as simple as a cold, which we'll be addressing something like that, or as complicated as something like cancer or trauma or something major, right? We're going to have wellness and we're going to have sick periods. And I think it is worth discussing the sick periods and how those are going to impact our spiritual practice, why they happen, how to metaphysically help with them, and what to do about it. Because the thing is, and I say this in a careful way, I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Every disease, physical, mental, or spiritual, does have a spiritual component to it. Now, I am not arguing that all problems are, spiritual in nature, right? I do not believe that, like, you develop lung cancer because you're doing something spiritually wrong. That's not what I'm arguing. But what I am arguing is that when you have something like lung cancer, there is a spiritual component to that disease, right? Your emotional, physical, and spiritual health are linked. And so if you are dealing with some really heavy disease, that's going to have impacts on your spiritual health, right? That does not mean you did something wrong. I'm not trying to blame people for their conditions, nor am I saying they're entirely caused by spirituality. That's not what I'm getting at all. Just that when you experience something like this, there's a spiritual component to it, right? Everything we do has many dimensions. We understand, just in metaphysics, that we are the material plane, right? We are the bottom of the tree of life. And then above it, there are all these planes and spheres of existence. And the truth is, while it may look like a diagram where things are all separated, in reality, it's all happening concurrently and at the same time, right? There's all these dimensions going on. And so whenever anything happens in our small world, it is also happening on all these higher levels, and the higher levels of our body of light are being impacted by them. So I want to talk about the three types of disease that I'm going to be exploring in this podcast, and I'm going to be going through all of them. So that would be mental disease, physical disease, and spiritual disease. So I'm going to start with mental diseases because I think that is the one that people talk about the most, because I think it is the one that a lot of people when they're new are struggling with, because when we get into esotericism, when you get into religion, all these things, often it is people coming from a place of desiring to self-improve. And so you do see a lot of people getting into religion and becoming religious when they are dealing with some sort of struggle of that regard, right? It's very common. You see it across religions, right? A lot of people get into Christianity for these reasons. A lot of people get into like all sorts of things. So I do want to start there. And I have discussed some of this a little bit, but I do think it's worth going over. So I want to separate mental disease into kind of two categories because I think they interface with esotericism differently. And that would be things that are genetic, like things you were born with, and then things that are based on your environment or situation, right? So if you are someone who has a sort of genetic mental condition, right? Like it's something you have throughout your whole life, it's never going to go away, and it wasn't caused by a specific event, it just kind of is something you manage. Um, People with that situation when they get into esotericism, they need to have a level of caution, right? Um, and I don't believe the idea that like these people should be barred from esotericism. That's a conversation that's been had many, many times, right? Should people with these conditions be completely banned from getting into esotericism from religion because of fears of things like spiritual psychosis? And I say absolutely not. I do not think this is a thing that bars you because we all are having spiritual experiences. You know, the gods don't cease to exist because of certain conditions you have. But if you are one of these people, you need to be very aware of your own mind and what is going on so that you are completely able to manage it and know where your limits are. I think if this is something you deal with, you really have to know your limits and you have to have a lot of self awareness. I talk about how, and this is my own idea, that mysticism kind of has three branches to it to be effective and to be good. And that is the branch of study, practice, and contemplation. And if you are someone who has one of these conditions, you really need to think about that third branch, the contemplation branch. And what contemplation is thinking, right? But it's a deeper thinking. It's going in and looking into your inner self and trying to make sense of it. Contemplation can be done just by thinking, just literally sitting in like a meditative state and thinking, or with tools like divination. I think for people like this, using things like tarot or runes can be incredibly helpful, as these things kind of help you explore different archetypes and help you have a greater understanding of what is going on. So I just think the big thing is you need to contemplate to a higher degree than the person who does not have these problems. And now I do think spiritual psychosis is a conversation worth having. I am not someone who denies the existence of spiritual psychosis. There are some people out there that claim spiritual psychosis is not real. People who have conditions like schizophrenia just have gifts. I think that's completely wrong, and I think that that's dangerous rhetoric. I think that that's, a complete misunderstanding of these conditions. Obviously, we have experiences mystically that some people would think are psychosis, right? Especially in a secular materialist culture, right? Like if you say that you have like heard a god talking to you or have had a vision, like a lot of people are going to call that psychosis. Now, it is not psychosis. A mystic experience is not psychosis, and actually according to psychiatry itself, mystic experiences are not inherently psychosis in nature. They actually distinguish it. So no, those are not psychosis, but I think spiritual psychosis at the same time does exist, right? Some people who have things like delusions and hallucinations do have delusions and hallucinations about religious subject matter, right? And there are people who have delusions like I'm a god, or like, Hades is in love with me, or I have to do all these crazy things, or something really, really horrible is going to happen, like all of that stuff. And I've had a conversation with some people who have dealt with this just to see, their thoughts on mysticism, their thoughts on these things. And they've made a really interesting point that people who have spiritual psychosis are dealing with other problems at the same time. And often that spiritual psychosis is incoherent or contradictory, um, or is something that only happens when their life is really dysregulated. And so their mystic experiences are not improving their life, they're actually causing, they're not mystic experiences, I mean episodes. They're not causing an improvement in life quality, they're causing a decrease in life quality. And as we go through mystic experiences, as we grow spiritually, our goal is to improve our lives. Obviously, our goal is also things like gnosis, things like enlightenment, things like spiritual growth. Obviously, that is a big part of this. But, you know, it is going to improve our lives, right? We do want to be more virtuous than we were before. We want to be, someone who's living a better life, who's doing better, and who's helping our community and becoming a stronger person. And if you are having experiences and it is doing the opposite, that could be a sign of psychosis, or it could be a sign that you are interacting with spirits that are not good for you, right? Your life should be getting better, and your piety should be increasing, your happiness should be increasing, your relationship should be getting better as you progress spiritually. And if you're not seeing that, that is definitely a sign of some sort of problem. It's hard for me to diagnose everyone's, right, but because there will be individual circumstances, but that's not something that should happen. And so people who are having spiritual psychosis, they're seeing a rapid decrease in life quality. They're often experiencing other delusions concurrently. and they're dealing with other symptoms. So there is a big difference between these two things, and I think that denying that either of these things are real, either denying that mystical experience is real or denying that spiritual psychosis is real, is really just a very unhelpful way to view things. Now, if you are someone who has one of these genetic based mental illnesses, right? Um, how can you effectively have a spiritual practice is the next question, right? Because obviously we know that you need to have a lot more contemplation and a lot more of an understanding of your limits. So how does that actually look, right? Obviously contemplation is number one, but number two is I really think people with these conditions, especially ones that I've talked to who have very successful spiritual practices, they do a lot of meditation, and I think everyone should be meditating. I don't think that there is anyone who should not be meditating. I think meditation is just so incredibly important if you want to have any sort of spiritual growth. I don't think you can really have a good spiritual practice without meditation. And the people who claim they do have a good spiritual practice without meditation are often doing something that essentially is meditation. They're just not calling it that. Like there's a lot of things that I think do count as meditation that people will call something slightly different, like the Catholic mystic idea of contemplative prayer. I do think that is a form of meditation. Now, it's not called that, but what is it in practice? So there's things like that, but like doing a lot more meditation than normal. And the next thing is you're gonna really have to ground. So grounding is something you do before and after ritual to basically return to center and facilitate that transition and break between the mundane world and the mystical world, right? It's that in and out section. A grounding thing that I really like is to just lay down, or you can do the standing too. I like laying on my back. You can't really do that if you're in a group ritual setting, but you can do it standing up in a group ritual setting where basically you'll visualize coming out of your body these like tree roots, right? And you're rooting yourself back into the mundane world. And then you view the energy kind of, if you're standing, like exiting out your feet, or if you're laying, exiting out your back. Now, you can do this in reverse for getting ready for a ritual, like you grow the roots and then it kind of comes into you. That's a very common way of doing it. But this type of like ending practice, it's most important at the end. But I do think if you're grounding, you should probably do it on both sides. But if you have one of these conditions, grounding at the end is going to be so important because it's going to make a clear distinction of the mystic and the mundane, right? And I think that distinction is going to really help because then you'll know the difference between something like a mystical experience and something that is more caused by mental health issues. So always ground. I think also, keeping really intense track on your practice, having a really detailed magical record or book of shadow or grimoire, whatever you want to call that, like your notebook or, can file on your computer, if for some people, right, of your experiences. I think it's good to do just journal entries into that if you have one of these conditions. And also, working with your moods or your symptoms and seeing how they relate to what you're doing spiritually, I think is really good, like tracking these things, keeping records, and just being as self-aware as you possibly can about what is going on. Now, if you are unable to do these things and you have one of these conditions, you just got to go slow. And I think you need to not compare yourself to someone who does not have one of these conditions, who are going to inherently be starting at a different place than you, right? The gods meet you where you are. And I think when you start comparing yourself to everyone around you and your practice to the practice of everyone around you, it can cause a lot of self doubt and insecurity and just a lot of things that you kind of don't want. So just be aware of what you're at. Now, I'm going to now talk about trauma or environment based mental illness, especially people with like PTSD type conditions. Um, this affects a spiritual practice completely differently. It really doesn't affect it in the same way like the other stuff would, right? Like you're not really worrying about things like psychosis or, moods that are going to make you not fully get the ritual or something. You're more thinking about how will my trauma impact what I am doing, and how do I, have a successful spiritual practice without causing trauma based symptoms, right? So I think the thing that needs to come up with this is shadow work. So shadow work has been pushed really, really hard by like mainstream, especially in like the witchcraft space. It was really, really big on witch talk. And it's a really good practice. It's kind of a derivative practice from Jungian psychology. So Jung had this idea of the shadow, right? Like there's all these components of the soul, and the shadow is kind of your subconscious. It's your taboo part, it's your repressed part, and a lot of your kind of trauma is with the shadow. And so a lot of people do this thing where they try to interface with their shadow and understand their shadow and enter into that shadow part of the self to understand the self and reach state of stealth mastery. And then the ultimate goal of shadow work is integration. So we understand this soul has all these parts to it, and the ultimate goal is to find harmony and balance and bring the whole soul together. And so the goal of shadow work is shadow integration, right? You bring the shadow into the whole, and basically you don't eliminate the shadow, you don't eliminate these parts of yourself, but you have absolute mastery and control over them, right? That's the goal. Now, the thing with people with trauma and shadow work is that it can get really messy really, really fast. Because a lot of shadow work techniques are essentially delving into the hardest things that have happened to us in our lives. They're looking into these things and in some cases literally doing visualizations and meditations to relive it. It's invoking spirits like Saturn that relate to karma and all these very heavy things, spirits like Erishkigal that relate to death, all these very heavy chthonic hard things to work through. And if you are someone with trauma and that trauma is fresh or it's not something you can safely explore, this can cause a lot of problems. A really extreme example of this is Teal Swan. So she's like a new age girl. She's another creator, but she's big enough that I feel like I can name her because Hulu actually did a series on her a while ago that I watched. It's very interesting. I would actually recommend the Hulu series on Teal Swan. It's quite good. Um, and she does a lot of things where you do these very intense meditations and explorations of things you struggle with. And a really extreme technique she has is for people who struggle with suicidality to visualize your suicide, right? All of these techniques are incredibly polarizing because they are essentially shadow work cranked up really high. It's like a really extreme form of shadow work where you're literally living through and re-experiencing the worst stuff or experiencing bad stuff that hasn't happened to you yet that you're, you know, I guess interested in. I don't know if interested in is the right phrase. And I feel very conflicted about these techniques. And when I was watching the documentary, it made me think about a lot because a lot of the techniques that I was seeing on Witch Talk really did resemble this. And I think for some people, these techniques can actually be helpful. A lot of people write these techniques off as entirely toxic because they absolutely are completely toxic for certain people. And there is I believe it was someone did one of these and then committed suicide or something. Someone died as a result of one of these practices, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but there was some incident where someone really got messed up by one of these practices. And I can absolutely understand why that would happen. I can see how that would happen. If you're not ready to see these things, it's going to fuck you up. And if your spiritual teacher is telling you to do this without giving you 18 million caveats and ways to get out of this safely and re-enter the world, like, I think that can go really, really bad really fast. And I think all of shadow work can actually get really bad really, really fast. I think it's a really powerful technique. I've used shadow work myself and had success from it, but I think just telling people do shadow work without any context around it, especially for people who do have trauma, I think that can get so dangerous, and I think it can be incredibly destructive. In general, these chthonic, heavy, Saturnian type energies, they are malefic, right? And I use malefic, not evil, for a reason, right? They are destructive in nature. And in spirituality, we understand creation and destruction go together, and to create something new, you do need to destroy what previously existed, right? If you've ever had someone read a tarot card for you and you've pulled Death or the Tower, these cards that have to do with really intense transformation, that come out of destruction, you'll know that destruction is sometimes necessary. You'll know that, if you go down, like, say, an hermetic path long enough, there's things like crossing the abyss that people are going to bring up to you, right? Doing a ritual to throw yourself into the dark night of the soul to come out on the other side. But the thing is, some people cannot come out on the other side, right? It's very much a sink or swim thing. At the bottom of the abyss is spirits like Karanzan, right? Like, these practices can be really, really toxic for some people. And I think if you have any sort of trauma at all, I think you really need to approach a lot of these type of practices with heavy, heavy caution, and don't just do it because people on the internet encourage you to do it, right? Do not, like, do stuff with Doth or Saturn or shadow work or Hecate. Even, like, Hecate stuff can get into this territory at times. Do not utilize Datura for entheogenic purposes, like all these things. You need to stay away from that until you have your mental health under check. And then if you want to explore these things, because they do have really powerful, you know, elements to them. They're incredibly powerful. They're some of the most powerful spiritual techniques out of there. You have to go into it slowly. You have to pace yourself. In general, I think one of the things that I've been seeing, and one of the things that I actually used to do, is rush. Right? People want to rush through spirituality and do things that they're not ready for because they want to, like, have checked off certain boxes, right? And the path is slow. You're on it for the rest of your life. I've seen the demographics of, like, the age of people who listen to my show, right? It's mostly like the majority of you guys are between 25 and 35. That's most people who listen to this. There's some people younger and there's some people older, right? But for the most of people listening to this, like, you guys are relatively young. You have a lot of time to do all these things. I'm young. I have a lot of time to do other things. And so there are spiritual things that, are I haven't done yet. And you haven't done yet, and that's okay. We should be progressing at a speed that we need, and sometimes, we'll have spiritual experiences that we need to slow down in. I think of myself, so I've been doing the Enochian Aethers, right? And I've been working through the Enochian Aethers through scrying them incredibly slowly. I have, I'm going super slow, and there's a reason why I'm doing that, because every time I scry an Aether, something, I get some revelation, I get something I see that is sometimes really, really hard to work through. So I did this one Aether. I actually started with this Aether that people have worked up to be like the scariest Aether. So I decided to start with that just to get it done with. I also, when I did the Planetary Spears initiation, I started with Saturn and then worked to the Sun, right? I kind of enjoy heavy chthonic ritual. I kind of like it. I like, doing these things first, right? And then it getting easier. But anyways, I did the infamous one, and people have named this Aether jokingly the Sin Cube. Because a lot of people, what they do is when they scry this Aether, they see this group of angels and they're holding this cube. And when you touch the cube, you basically get this, like, reel of your vices and problems that you have spiritually, right? So I scry this Aether, and it actually showed me something very different than what I was expecting. Like, I there were a few things I actually expected to see. Like, I kind of went in and I'm like, I'm expecting these things to happen. I'm expecting, me to get spiritually called out by the angels in a very specific way. And when I did the ritual, I was called out in a very different way. It was not what I was expecting. It actually really shocked me. And then I started really thinking about the ritual, and I was like, no, this actually is kind of the core and the root of these other things that I was thinking would come up, right? What is the core of it? What is the base of it? What is that kind of spine? And I didn't know what that spine was, and I realized it in this ritual. And so having that big of a realization, I don't think right after that, scrying the next one, the next day would make sense, because that's a lot to process and that's a lot to work through. And so after I got this revelation, I spent months and months and months doing rituals to try to, make sense of this and, work through that specific problem before moving to the next thing. And so I've been only doing an Aether every couple months. I'm moving super slow. And I think that's, actually a very effective way to do it, because that means I'm really taking the gnosis I've gained from a ritual and letting myself spend a lot of time with it. And then from that, actually get the most out of it. I think some people really do speed run things. And when you speed run through rituals, you're going to miss stuff and you're going to not, see it fully unfold. So definitely go slow. Now, I think a good way to explore trauma outside of shadow work is through things like path working or ritual themselves. So, what I mean by that is by invoking certain spirits that can help you get through it, and doing healing stuff, right? Invoking literal, like, gods of healing, right? Gods of the sun, like things to help you, not just seep into it, but also get out of it and have more light in your life. Like, there are other things that should go into, if you are someone with a lot of trauma, processing that trauma, besides like just shadow work and sinking into it, right? You can sink into something, but you still have to make out of it. Like, we think of everything as life, death, rebirth. After you die, you have to be reborn. And so there's more to trauma work than just shadow work. And I think that's sometimes neglected. Now, the next type of disease that I want to explore is spiritual diseases. So, what is a spiritual disease? So, just like we have physical disease, we can get spiritual disease. These are diseases and ailments on our body of light, our metaphysical body. The main one that I think of, and that I think is the most important, actually comes from Sufism, but I think this does apply broadly. I think this is probably one of the best insights of the Sufis, and that is the spiritual diseases of the heart. So, we all have, a heart, and the heart center is the seat of your soul, right? And within that seat of your soul, you can get diseases. And a lot of our vices, our sins, whatever you want to call it, stem from these diseases. There's a really good book, and it's been a big influence on me called, I believe it is called The Purification of the Heart, is the name of the book. Um, it's really, really good. It's by, here it is, by Hamza Yusuf. Purification of the, it is called, I'm checking, just make sure I'm right. Yes, Purification of the Heart: Signs, Symptoms, and Cures of the Spiritual Disease by Heart by Hamza Yusuf. It's a very, very good book. It is explicitly Sufi, so it's not pagan in nature, but I think it's still a book worth reading because it has a lot of really good insights. And basically, what it is that we all have these things like envy, jealousy, resentment, all these things are in our heart, and they're kind of like pollutants, right? They darken our spiritual heart. And the way to fix these diseases is purification. And the only way we can be purified is by approaching the Godhead, approaching the gods, and using them to clear us. And this actually really feeds into the idea of miasma, which is a Hellenic idea that we accumulate spiritual pollution, and the way to eliminate that pollution is through a process called catharsis. Specifically, basically, catharsis is reuniting with the divine order, reuniting with divine law by conjuring spirits like Zeus, specifically the epithet Zeus Catharsius, to basically realign us. And miasma is acquired in small ways, like getting dirty, but also when we do things that violate divine law. And a lot of these spiritual diseases of the heart are kind of the causes of why we do actions that violate divine law, right? The disease themselves, like envy itself, is not an action, it is a state of mind. But what does envy lead us to do? What envy leads us to do is behaviors that then are things against the divine law of the gods as established by the Platonist, right? You start doing things that, they lead to that. And so the source of all these things that actually cause the miasma, and the miasma is the pollution that holds us away from the gods, and at times, if it's bad enough, can literally bar us from the gods, to an extent until we are purified. That comes from the spiritual diseases. And so to fix the miasma, of course you need to seek out catharsis, but you also need to seek out catharsis for the disease itself, for the thing that is causing it, the stem, the root of the problem. And these roots of these problems are spiritual diseases. And these spiritual diseases will corrode us spiritually. And they, are things that have to be resolved in order to alchemically transmute ourselves in a way that unites us with the gods, because the ultimate goal is to be united with the gods. That's why we're doing all of this, right? That's the point. And so to get that gnosis, to get that unification, we need to be in a pure state where we can unify. We need to, quote unquote, in the word of the New Agers, ascend, right? And you cannot ascend if there are things holding you down, like heavy anchors, like heavy rocks, like weights, like strapping you and chaining you down to the ground. And those spiritual diseases of the heart are things that chain you to the ground. And so it is so important to break away from these spiritual diseases of heart and identify what they are. And once again, that is why I think contemplation is so important and something we need to be doing. Now, other spiritual diseases can be caused by like interacting with bad spirits, right? Interacting with evil spirits, ghost in your location, and if you have ghosts in your house, you should be banishing. Oh my God, why are you not banishing? Because those will go away. When I was younger and I first got interested in esotericism, the place where I was living had a really bad ghost problem, right? And once I got more advanced and I learned how to do wards and banish and purify, like the ghost problems, I've not had ghost problems since. Like it never happens. And that's just because I got my shit together and I learned how to purge these things out and make the space better. So just all of these things will eradicate, your ghost and your other things. But basically evil spirits, also spirit attachments. If you have any degree of spiritual oppression or attachments to you, you need to exercise those off of you. Those will cause spiritual diseases. And often, if you have a spirit kind of attached to you in a very low grade form of possession, they will actually inflict more diseases in your heart that did not exist previously and cause you a lot of problems. This is why I recommend doing things like the headless ritual regularly, so that you kind of don't ever get to such an icky state where any of this is an actual problem that you need to be concerned about. If you are in that state, you're probably not going to have spiritual attachments. Now, the next way you can get, spiritual diseases is initiating into specific systems. So not all initiations are good initiations. I think there's a lot of people who just want to like initiation max, like they want to be part of every single spiritual system in the world. They want to do everything. They don't want to, have a path. And I see this most people who are like chaos types, right? They'll be like, "Oh, well, I'm doing chaos magic, so I'm going to do 18 different systems that contradict each other cuz, in my theological worldview it makes sense." And like yeah, you can justify it in that way, but that doesn't change what's going to happen, right? Certain energies and certain spirits do not work well together. They contradict, and certain systems as a whole are just bad for you. Like there are certain things that are just metaphysically, essentially poisonous to you. Um, and you need to be aware of like, are the things I'm doing making sense together, and are those energies going to work together? Because if you're dealing with 8 million contradictory energies and following different sets of spiritual law that all don't match, like you're going to have a lot of problems. And if you're initiating into systems that are fundamentally corrosive and bad for your spiritual body, you're going to have spiritual disease as well. Um, a lot of really hard, like left hand path type systems I would say are spiritually corrosive. I think that especially the Klapoth, I do not think Klapoth initiations are a good idea. I have known people, I knew someone who did a Klapothic initiation and they felt like they were being covered in slime and like oil, like in like a sewer grate. And they started noticing that they felt sick, they felt gross, like everything felt wrong. And that's because they had essentially initiated into like the spiritual garbage can, right? Because what are the Klapoth? They're the husk around the shells of the Sephiroth in Kabbalistic metaphysics. They are the spiritual gutter. And if you're initiating into the spiritual gutter, you're gonna get dirty. And if you initiate into other systems that are like really just corrosive in nature, you're gonna have problems, right? Like if you were to initiate into a really Plutonian current of magic, yeah, you're gonna feel gunky and you're gonna get spiritual diseases. And so for this reason, you should only initiate into systems that are actually beneficial to you. Like don't just initiate to have another initiation or because oh, this ritual looks interesting. Like do things consciously and mindfully. Like don't just do whatever's in front of you. Don't just do whatever thing is right there. Like think logically about what you're dealing with, because if you initiate into the wrong system it can really mess you up, because unfortunately some initiations are things you cannot undo, right? If you initiate into some really dark system you may have opened a door that you cannot close later, and that may cause you spiritual consequences for a really long time. And I am not trying to fearmonger, I'm not trying to freak people out or deter people from doing initiations, because initiations are great. Initiations are actually very important on your path, and at some point you are going to need to initiate. Maybe not with a group, maybe a solitary initiation, or do some sort of ritual that essentially functions as an initiation. But there are some things you should not do. And I think that we need a critical mind with this and not just do whatever seems cool or edgy, or you know what I mean. Like do what is spiritually best for you. Don't just do things because you want to do them. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the evil eye. So the evil eye is a very common curse that people deal with, and the evil eye is often cast unintentionally. It is something that people are not always intentionally sending out, but sometimes are sending out. And basically, the evil eye is it's a result of envy, but it's where people, they compliment you and they envy you, and since they're complimenting you in this way that is envious and kind of malicious at the same time being nice, it sort of spiritually poisons you, and in some cases literally functions as a curse. Um so you gotta be aware of that. The evil eye is thankfully very easy to get rid of. You can have one of those little evil eye charms, and that will literally deter it. Or if you get the evil eye thrown at you, since these are not like conscious generational curses, you can pretty much take a cleansing bath or do the headless ritual one time, and you're good. No, there are other curses that are much more substantial and serious. And those I would not consider spiritual illnesses 100% because they are kind of their own thing. But those you just do curse breaking. I've done YouTube videos discussing curses already, so you can just check that out. And hear my full advice for curses, because I don't really think it needs to be rehashed. Um, Now, I want to talk about what happens when you have a spiritual practice while being spiritually diseased. A lot of your rituals are not going to work right. or you're going to do them halfway. You're going to have your mind wander a lot during rituals. Things just aren't going to turn out how they're supposed to turn out. And if this is happening like at all, that is a sign that you immediately need to do divination. I think that all spiritual diseases should be diagnosed properly through divination or scrying. Scrying is kind of a form of divination, but it's kind of its own thing. Just diagnose the problem, and then you're going to need to go through a purification process, a recovery process. And I can't tell you how long that's going to take because all of these things are different. And spiritual diseases with time become more entrenched and more severe, right? If you've been dealing with the spiritual disease of envy for like 10 years, starting with you as a child watching Margot Robbie on TV and like having, envious thoughts about her to now, right? That's going to be a long time to uproot. Now, it does not mean you need to entirely drop the rest of your spiritual practice. I think for very extreme cases, you do need to do only purification for a period of time. But in lighter cases, you need to do purification on top of other stuff you're doing. And when you're doing your like prayers, you need to do purification first, then the rest of what you're doing. Like, don't ever skip the purification. So now I'm going to talk about the next set of diseases, and that is physical disease. So this is going to be your sicknesses, your injuries, like the literal stuff that happens to your body that sends you to a normal doctor. So physical illness does impact your spiritual practice because when you are physically ill, you have certain limitations, right? And you need to think about your physical limitations when doing ritual because a lot of rituals, especially if we're talking about ceremonial magic, they have a physical dimension to them, right? We're talking about walking around, lighting candles, making a circle, doing certain gestures, doing certain breaths for an extended period of time. And if we're talking about mysticism, we're talking about maybe doing dance or walking around or moving in specific days or doing specific breaths, all these things. For specific physical diseases, that might be difficult. Now, I've been accused many, many times of like hating disabled people or hating injured people because I've said it's not an excuse. Because it's not an excuse. You can do ritual and mysticism while having these conditions. But, and this is the but that people who critique me miss, you will have to modify it, right? You can modify something and make it work for you. As long as the correspondences are fundamentally the same, the thing is going to work. And the gods understand your limitations and, experience it with you. They're not just, you know what I mean? They're not looking for a specific input. It's not a calculator, right? So they're still going to receive what you're getting. And so I do not think having some sort of condition is like some get out of jail free card. Like I can misbehave spiritually all I want. I don't have to care about spiritual purity. I can do whatever I want. Like that, no. And that's toxic. And I don't think it's also an excuse for laziness, right? In many cases, if you have a broken leg, like, yeah, maybe you can't do ritual dance, but you can move your upper body, right? You could do breath work. You could do all these things. And you can even do things like you can visualize it, right? If you're someone who's like immobile for some reason or paralyzed, or something like that, or you're bedridden for a little bit, you can do these rituals as people will say like quote unquote in the astral, just basically visualizing it, right? And doing it with your body of light instead of your physical body, right? You can always move your body of light. The arm cannot break on your body of light. So there are many ways to make these things work for you. Now, if you're a member of a specific organization, that organization might not be able to modify what they're doing for you, and that may lead to you being kept out, but you can still do things by yourself. It's not like you can't. You know what I mean? And now, if you are someone who's dealing with what I would call mild illness, like a cold or a flu, we all are going to deal with this at some point. Um, you should modify too. I don't think you should skip your rituals. I've seen a lot of people be like, "Well, I have a cold, so I'm going to skip my rituals today." No, just do a different version of them. If like you have laryngitis and you've lost your voice, obviously with many things you want to say a mantra out loud, or you want to read the invocation out loud, or you want to use your voice, right? But you have laryngitis. Oh my God, you can't read out loud. So what are you going to do? You're going to read it with your mind, right? You're going to look at it. And you're going to say it in your basically mind's voice, right? That will suffice if that is what you can do, right? That's what you got to do in certain cases, and that's okay. Now, if you have what I would call a moderate physical illness, that's like a longer term, I marked this on my notes as longer term but not permanent. Okay, like pneumonia, or you're bedridden for a year or something like that. Um, then you probably are going to have to think like long term, like, okay, so what's my practice going to look like now? Like, go back to the drawing board, do some contemplation, think about how you can adapt your previous practice into your situation now, so that you're not abandoning things, you're just kind of doing things a little differently. Now, if you have like some sort of chronic, like lifelong illness, but it's not something that's going to kill you, you've really got to make a permanent plan. I think planning is really good, and often like writing out things that we want to do, our spiritual goals, can be very helpful. And so I would recommend doing that. Like, think about your spiritual goals and make a plan to achieve them, with all of your limitations and your struggles in mind. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is terminal illness. This is thankfully not something I personally experience, but I'm not dying currently, but there are a lot of people who will be dying, and if you are experiencing some sort of terminal illness, it's very important to start doing rituals relating to your next life, the afterlife, and death. At this point, you really need to orient your practice around that and what is going to happen after this current life. There are certain things that you should be doing to prepare yourself for that next step and be aware of where things are heading. So your practice at that point just needs to look very different, right? Because now you've got a different goal. Like, it's not just like miasma purifying now in this moment, it's preparing for what's going to happen next and the next step on your journey, because death is not the end, it is the beginning of the next part of your story. So focusing on that is going to be very, very important. Approaching death from a metaphysical standpoint is hard and tricky and painful, but it is something we must do at some point, because it is something that is going to come for all of us. I'm going to die, you are going to die, we are all going to die. Isn't that lovely and cheery? But it is something we should talk about, right? And that is part of why we do esotericism, because with esotericism, we have tools that we can go into the next life with that someone who had stayed away from it had not. And I find mystics, I wrote a Substack on like fear of death and why people like us may fear death a little less and how to think about death and frame that. But death is not inherently bad. It's not scary. It's just the next part of the chapter. So processing those type of feelings and those type of things in your practice is going to be very important at this stage. Now, the last thing I want to discuss is basically like healing physical illness through esotericism. This is a big conversation that a lot of people have had. Like, can you cure illnesses through religion? Their entire religion's based around this. I believe Christian Science is really based around this. Like, curing yourself with prayer instead of doctors, and mysticism instead of doctors. And I'm going to give a kind of nuanced take. I think that if you have a physical illness, you should be working on it physically, like with a doctor, or some sort of other medical practitioner, and on a spiritual level. I don't think you need to like choose one or the other. I don't think like if you have cancer, you need to not get chemo or something crazy and just only do crystals. Like, obviously get chemo, but you can also pray to the gods. You can also pray to healing gods like Asclepios or Apollo, right? You don't need to just do chemo, and you don't need to just pray. Like, there's no, this dichotomy I find really bizarre. I every time I see it, it like weirds me out. Like, I don't understand why this dichotomy is imposed on people, because historically the science and the spiritual were not dichotomous like this. Like, a lot of modern medical techniques actually come from spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices, and vice versa to some extent. Like, our understanding of astrology is impacted by astronomy. Like, as we've learned more about like astronomy and how the planets move and all this stuff, like astrology has changed with it. I mean, the entirety of quote unquote modern astrology really is based on planets that we didn't see until astronomy progressed to a certain extent. Now, I think there is a conversation worth having about how science has become a religion to some, and people really hold science on this pedestal that it's not meant to be held on, and people like treat scientists like these like priestly caste of like philosopher kings, and forget that science at the end of the day is a method. And that is definitely worth discussing. And there are, governments and countries that have taken advantage of science and medicine to do horrible things to their population. All these things. Like, there's a lot of complexity around it, and the medical system itself is messed up in so many ways, and like a lot of the stuff we say is healthy is actually really bad for you. And so there's a lot of nuance there that I don't know. There are many other people who have gotten into that in a much better way than I have. And I'm not a science podcast, so I don't really think that's my role. But I think you can do both. I don't think you need to choose. And healing magic is a big thing. A lot of like folk magic was started by healers who people would go to cure their illnesses. There are some amazing like mystical medicinal systems like Ayurveda. I'm a big fan of Ayurveda. I've actually applied some Ayurvedic eating principles to my life, and have seen a lot of growth and progress. And I think the Ayurvedic idea of the doshas is these kind of humors that you balance really goes along with a lot of my beliefs on the elements and the planets, and balancing your composition in that regard. It really aligns with a lot of the spiritual things I believe with. So I really do recommend looking into Ayurveda. I think it's really, really cool. There's also TCM, or traditional Chinese medicine, that I believe has a spiritual dimension to it. I don't know a lot about Chinese metaphysics, so I can't really, give a huge explanation of that, but I know there is dimensions to that. Um, Now, there are systems, I think of German New Medicine is what it's called, that argue that all disease is spiritual or emotional in origin. Basically, the argument of German New Medicine is any disease you have is caused by emotional dysregulations and traumas you've experienced. And so you develop, cancer, or, something like that, like endometriosis or whatever, because of some trauma you've had. I do not agree with this. I think this gets really weird, and I think it goes in strange directions. So totally disagree with that. But when you have a disease, it's going to affect you spiritually, and if you were having spiritual problems, it's certainly going to make your disease worse. And I think at times there are things that are brought on by spiritual and emotional problems, especially gastric issues. I've noticed a lot of people get like IBS type stuff that is literally not physical in origin. It's literally like emotional, spiritual in origin. And so some things are emotional and spiritual in origin, but some things are not. And I don't think it's fair to tell someone with lung cancer that it's spiritual in origin, when in reality they were just smoking cigarettes for 20 years. So very complicated. And at the end of the day, you can use the gods to help you get better and to manage your symptoms and to make you feel better. Is it going to fix everything? No. But can it make you more comfortable? Can it help you grow? Yes. And if you're struggling with something that does not bar you from spirituality, does not mean, your magic won't work, right? It's still going to work, and there's still a reason to be interested in esotericism. So that's all I have to say. If you enjoyed this podcast, please check out our Patreon. That is how we are supported. On the Patreon, you get a bonus episode every Sabbath. So that's 8 times a year. You get a early access to all the podcasts, and you get your name read out if you're a high enough tier. So a lot of really cool things on the Patreon. I also am on Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, Twitter, YouTube. YouTube's my main place, but I'm on every single social media platform. I don't know when I'm not on. So yeah, find me there. I'm under the username .darling. And if you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, please leave a review. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for continued support, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a lovely day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are.